Alan, your bio says you taught screenwriting in maximum security prisons.
Yeah.
So many questions about that. What did they ask you? First question. What did these people, I'm sure they were happy to see you, very inquisitive.
It was, what did they ask me? I don't think they, first of all, teaching in maximum security prison is it's scary because these are, at least initially it's scary because you think you're going to be surrounded by guards and there aren't any guards. So they send you in and they close the door and then there's these 100 guys and me and no guards. And I was initially terrified. And but these guys were so sweet. I mean, they're not sending you, they're sending people who've earned the right to be in the workshop. And so they've displayed good behavior. But it was initially terrifying. And I got up there and I'm teaching about transformation and I'm talking about how one, the story ultimately is about how one changes oneself and or the protagonist experiences some kind of shift in perception. And they were incredibly sweet, incredibly eager and grateful. And I can't remember any specific question, but I do remember that they had great questions and that there was this sort of shocking level of humility with them that I don't get as much with a lot of my regular students. So sometimes you get people and they sort of feel like they know it all, but these guys had really incredible stories to tell. And there was an openness to tell these stories, almost as if it almost felt like they were kind of bursting to tell these stories. And I remember we took a break. I was teaching out in the high desert at, I can't remember the name of the prison, but they kind of rushed up to me, or some of them did, at the break. And it was almost like, I know we've only got a little bit of time here, but there's so much I want to learn. And I've got so many questions and wanting to tell me their personal stories. And very, very touching. It was a very moving experience. It's to teach in a maximum security prison.
Yeah, I find that so fascinating that you say that there was this humility and that they kind of had this openness, whereas if you were maybe teaching somewhere where, I hate to just assume, but if you think that maybe people hadn't had certain knocks in life, whether they're their own fault or whether they're not, whether they're innocent or guilty, that they would be, it's just interesting. I don't know if it's a class thing, I don't know if it's just life experience, I don't know what it is, but I find that fascinating.
Well, that's actually what I came away with was this realization that, you ever heard that saying, there but for the grace of God go I, that these people, they do often come from poverty, difficult circumstances, addiction, a lot of things that are kind of beyond their control, and this is their lot in life. There is also a lot of, I think the judicial system is racist and biased, and I don't think it's justice for all, and it's kind of heartbreaking. And you see these people who, may in some instances may have gotten a raw deal, even if they're guilty, in the sense that they not just that they may not have gotten proper legal, or decent legal representation, but that, you see that there's a lot of people in life who are kind of screwed because of just the raw deal they got growing up. So I just came away with kind of like we got a lot to be grateful for,
So when you go back into, let's say, if you want to call it the mainstream population, I don't know for lack of a better word, and you see people that come to classes or whatever, and they challenge different beliefs about story structure or writing or the need to take classes or whatever. Do you see that they are justified in being angry about certain things? Because sometimes you look at how angry people get over something as innocent as screenwriting, and you say, well, what's the justification for that? You can take it or leave it, like if you take what you like, leave the rest, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And some people seem very dogmatic about certain things, and it's almost like a fight about religion when it's just screenwriting.
Right. Well, those people don't stay very long in a class, and I also, I have no desire to argue with people, or that's not true. My interest as a writing teacher is to get to the truth. So if somebody's arguing with me about something or is staunchly holding a position, my question is that true? Is what you're saying true? Let's explore that. Let's examine it, because I have no dog in this race. I'm not dogmatic at all. I've been teaching a long time, been writing a long time, and I've got I've got a method that I'm teaching people, but I don't even know if I would actually call it a method, process that I'm teaching. And, I don't get into fights with people about writing. It's like, you really believe that, and you're so staunchly holding that point of view. Well, then good. How's it working for you? Is it helping you with your writing? If it is, then great. And if not, then, I see it a lot with writing teachers. I think there are a lot of writing teachers who are, it's almost like they've got to secure their sort of place in the world by eschewing everything that isn't what they teach. And that can be, I've seen it a lot where the latest thing is that some writing teachers say the 3-act structure is dead. It's remedial. It's not going to, it's going to kill any creativity. And the problem with that is that they don't understand what the 3-act structure is, because the 3-act structure is has nothing to do with plotting, in my opinion. And unfortunately, a lot of story structure is taught by story analysts who are sort of brilliant left-brainers and are really adept at deconstructing a masterpiece. And sort of the implication is that now that we've deconstructed this, you should go off and write your masterpiece. And while there's tremendous amount of value in studying film theory or film theory, because that's deconstructing Casablanca or Citizen Kane is going to help you understand how a story was built to some degree, but it's not going to teach you process. It's not going to teach you how to organize your ideas. When you look at a movie like Casablanca and you think about the Epstein brothers writing, or structuring this movie, I'm interested in the process. I'm interested in how did somebody come to write this. In other words, you can sort of like, just because you deconstruct something, it's like vivisection. You can't take something dead and look at all of its existing parts and then reanimate it. It's not going to come back to life. And so just because you can break down this thing into its sort of separate parts doesn't mean you're going to uncover the mystery of what the thing actually is. In other words, story structure is really the DNA of your protagonist's transformation. Does that make sense? Story structure is the DNA of a protagonist's transformation. It's not, in the midpoint, there should be a reversal. Like, I don't even know what that means. You hear it all the time with these story analysts. There should be a reversal. But what the hell is it? Does does It's a Wonderful Life have a reversal? That's where Mr. Potter offers Jimmy Stewart a job, and Jimmy Stewart says no. I don't know. I think of story structure as not a conceptual model, something you can figure out, but it's more of a experiential model. In other words, your protagonist goes through a series of experiences that lead to a transformation. And I think of story structure as an immutable paradigm for a spiritual transformation. Okay, it's immutable, it never changes, but that doesn't limit your creativity. That actually paradoxically opens your creativity. In other words, when you really understand what story structure is, it moves you beyond your limited imagination of what your story is. I always tell my writers, your idea of your story is not the whole story. It's not that it's incorrect, it's that it's incomplete. And so if you were to distill story structure to 3 words, it would be desire, surrender, transformation. So show me any story. You're going to have a character that wants something, desire. You're going to have a character that lets go of the meaning they made out of their goal, surrender. You're going to have a character that experiences transformation. In other words, a shift in perception, a reframing of their relationship to their goal. Show me a story that doesn't have that, and I'll show you a story that doesn't work, or is really experimental. Okay, but that's where when people, it happens not when I teach so much as if I do a lecture to a bunch of people. There's always the sort of the contrarian, the person who's like, I don't agree with that, and I'm like, that's great. Let's talk about that. But it's usually about something that they're trying to work out with themselves, and it's not really. It's usually that I don't know. It's usually like they're looking for some kind of fight rather than they're actually sincerely interested in deepening their process. So.
Do you think that teaching screenwriting or these books or whatever is selling false hope? That's one criticism of some of what we've seen, and I don't see why that would be selling false hope if that's something someone enjoys and they love the process of creating. Okay,
I love this because I believe that my job as a writing teacher is to facilitate writers in finding the story that lives within them and stay out of the result. In other words, when you get into the result, that's when you get tripped up. That's when you don't really write from your heart. That's when you don't write something that's actually going to be meaningful to other people. And so I always think of writing as a 2-tiered process. The first tier is you have to write it for yourself. And then the second tier is once you've written it for yourself, once you've written that stuff that you think, oh my God, I can't show this to anybody. It's way too personal. Even if it's fiction, especially if it's fiction. There's going to be, you've got to have some skin in the game. You've got to be invested in this thing that you're writing. You've got to let go of this idea that, is it going to sell? We can't, I remember when I wrote my first novel, I woke up one day and I was like, I've been writing for a long time. I was making a living as a stand-up comic, but I've been writing for a long time and I hadn't sold anything. And I thought, well, let me do the math here. Clearly I must be a mediocre writer if I've been writing for this long and haven't sold anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop writing for the marketplace, whatever that is. And I'm going to write something for myself. I'm going to write something that really means something to me. And I wrote a story that, and I wrote it really quickly. I wrote a novel called Diamond Dogs, and got it through this lawyer friend of mine. Got it to an agent. She auctioned it a week later for a ridiculous amount of money, and then it became a bestseller, and it won a bunch of awards, and it was the first time I realized that I don't know anything. And when I try and, that's why I say my idea of my story is never the whole story. My idea of who's going to like this or who's going to like that is, I can't control the result. None of us have any control over the result. But what we do have control over is understanding that we're all unique. We all have something valuable to say. And I really believe that as a writer and as a writing teacher. And so I want to help writers. I can't predict some of my students have gone on to become best-selling authors, showrunners, A-list screenwriters. I didn't know who they were going to be. But the ingredient that I think is most valuable isn't talent, whatever that is. It's a willingness to learn. It's a humility. It's a willingness to be curious about the story that lives within you. It's the humility to put it on the page while staying out of the result. That's really hard for people. That's the really challenging. That's the really challenging task. Being a writer is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And if you expect immediate results, you might not stay in the game long enough to experience the fruits of your labor.
You were doing comedy, stand-up comedy. You were able to make a living at it. Why transition to writing? What was it? Because so many people come to LA for that comic stream.
That's
I'm sure
a great
it's not
question.
easy.
I miss stand-up comedy so much. Boy, that's a loaded question to unpack because there's a lot of reasons. But the really simple reason is because I didn't love going on the road, and I got, when I sold my first novel and they backed up the money truck, I didn't have to go on the road, and it just became this thing where I just sort of became a full-time writer, and would still do stand-up occasionally. If somebody asked me, like a coffee shop on a Friday or Saturday night or something, I'd go and do stand-up, and I loved it. But it just became this thing that it sort of gradually fell away. And then it's also, if you don't do stand-up comedy every single night, you suck. It's like one of those things where it's muscle memory and you lose it so quickly. And so if you're not doing it and then you do it every, 3 weeks or 6 weeks, you go up and you go, oh my God, this feels so weird, and you got to get back into the rhythm. So it just became this thing where I was like, I don't really feel like going up and sucking tonight. And so it just became this thing that fell away from me. I also, stand-up comedy, it attracts a lot of people who are kind of damaged and broken. And, and I'm not excluding myself from that, but it's a world where you've got to be really committed to doing that. And I went through a lot of stuff. I had a lot of my friends. I mean, I've had, I think, 7 friends commit suicide. Stand-up comic just attracts a, dark element. And there was a part of me, my nickname in my 20s with all my comic friends was Crazy Al Watt. Okay, so these people are all out of their minds. And I was the crazy one. And I think it was because at that time I was really depressed and, just really, really not in a good place. But I talked about it all the time. I was like, I'm really, really not doing good today. And I think it made them uncomfortable, some of them. And so I got the nickname Crazy Al Watt. And, in retrospect, I think that it was that part of me that I think I had a survival instinct that was like, I would rather be comfortable in my own skin than chase after some, illusory fame or whatever. And so anyway, I was kind of, that part of me was kind of okay letting go of stand up and meeting a great woman, getting married, having a kid, becoming a writing teacher which has turned out to be probably something that I'm, was born to do. And I love being a writer, and I just published a new novel last week. It came out, and stand up is, you've got to really want it badly. When you see people who are successful stand-ups, you're seeing people who have sacrificed probably a tremendous amount to be doing what they're doing. And I have a lot of respect for stand-up comics and compassion. They're my people. I love them, and I really feel a kinship with comics now. I feel like there's a brotherhood and sisterhood with comics that nobody else understands with stand-up comics. I don't think anybody understands that, because when I talk to people who aren't stand-up comics, even the language, when they talk about them, there's an exotic quality to stand-up comics. When people talk about them, people are fascinated with stand-up comics. I wish I had an ending to this sentence.
Which came first, the comedy or the writing? Comedy.
Well, I mean, the comedy, you write your own material, but I was in high school, and I went to the School of the Arts in Toronto when I was about 17 or 18, and they had amateur nights on Monday nights at Yuck Yucks in Toronto, and I just started going there on Monday nights, and I was terrible, just bombing, every Monday night, but I wanted it so badly. And I remember there was a guy who would throw up before he went on stage every time. And I don't think that was that uncommon. It's bizarre that this thing is so terrifying to do, and yet it's a compulsion. And if you really work hard at it, you start to understand the mechanics of a joke, and it becomes really addictive. Like, there's no greater high than going on stage for 45 minutes or an hour in front of 400 people on a Saturday night and just killing, where they're just eating out of your hand. And just getting one laugh after another. It's the greatest feeling in the world. I get why people don't ever want to stop doing that.
But the beginning stages, I had
brutal.
Someone that I knew.
Stage. Yeah, I mean, for me, they were.
I mean, I can remember going to clubs with this person while they would do their acts, and maybe there'd be 5 people in the audience, and then I saw that the pain that this person went through outside of there, and that was their outlet for it, and then I got why they were addicted to it.
Oh yeah, it's the great. And when you start to get an act, and you start to get laughs, and you start to get your stage legs, it's really great. I mean, I get why you hear Jerry Seinfeld and Jay Leno say, we don't go on vacation. Vacation for us is going on the road. I get it. I mean, who wouldn't want to, go out in front of 5,000 people and just kill? And it's the best.
But then at some point you were writing or learning about novel structure or
From the beginning. From the beginning, okay. I always wanted to write stories.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so at some point you must have had enough time to work on this novel that you eventually got to your lawyer friend who got to the publisher?
Well, I mean, I never had a real job. I went on the road. I actually dropped out of high school 3 months prior to graduating because I got this one road gig. I mean, I was still on amateur nights, but the booking agent liked me. And I probably had about 12 minutes of material, and I was supposed to do 25 minutes at this club in London, Ontario, and so I wrote my material on the bus on the way to this gig, and I dropped out of high school so I could do this weekend gig, And then that was it. From there, I just started getting some work and making a really meager living, but enough to just barely pay the rent. And then from there, it just sort of evolved. This was in the 80s when there were so many comedy clubs opening, and there was such a dearth of actual really funny people. Like there's a quote from, I think it's Seinfeld. He says in the 70s there were 100 comics and 10 of them were funny. And in the 80s there were 10,000 comics and 10 of them were funny. Okay, so funny is a rare commodity. But in the 80s, if you could even fake funny, you could make a living. Not a great living, but you could make a living. And so I started making a living pretty early on. I don't think I was funny for the first 5 years, but you can fake being funny to people too. I don't know why I'm going off on this tangent, but you know, the really great comics are originals. But in the 80s, there were, you know, people were just sort of ripping off other people's personas or stealing their premises, or, you know, there were a lot of there were just a lot of hacks, a lot of hack premises, you know, airline material, or the difference between, you know, cats and dogs, or, you know, men and women, and just sort of hackneyed premises that are going to always elicit laughter. But it, you know, just because you're getting laughs doesn't mean you're funny.
So then once the book was picked up, you thought, okay, well then maybe this writing thing will become more of a habit. And how did you then train yourself to show up every day to write? Or maybe it wasn't every day to write.
It was every day, and there was no training. It was just passion. I just loved writing. It's harder now because my schedule's gotten so busy with teaching and family and you know, making, you know, setting up my next movie to make. But I just get up early now and write. I get up before my son gets up and get to work. But I don't know. I can't say that it's not difficult and that I don't get distracted, but I love writing and I work hard, so I try and write every single day. I definitely wrote every day for, you know, the first 15 years, you know, before I got married and had a kid, you know, so 20 years.
So you grew up in Canada,
Yeah.
and you grew up on a farm?
Yeah, I grew up on a strawberry farm.
Wow. And so was that part of your daily routine to get up early and you're tending to these berries or whatever?
Tending to the
Sorry,
berries. Well, the berries, strawberry season is about 3.5 weeks.
Okay.
So it doesn't last very long. But I was a kid then, so I was. I mean, I wrote then, but I wasn't writing every day. I probably started writing when I was about 15, or I remember the first time I really realized I wanted to write was in the 6th grade. I had a teacher named Mr. Bellsmith, and he had us write a 5-chapter novel about being shipwrecked. And it was the first time I really lost myself in my imagination and created this whole world on a desert island. This guy on a desert island who befriends a lion, and I thought, this is amazing. I didn't know I could do this, and then was shocked that was the last time any teacher ever asked us to be creative. But it activated this yearning in me for this desire to tell stories, and so I would write little plays, and, you know, I'd write jokes and stuff like that, and I'd watch, you know, the Tonight Show and see these comics come out, and it just seemed like the most amazing thing. This dude comes out, or this woman, and makes you laugh. You're just sitting at home watching this tube and this guy, and you're laughing for 5 minutes, and he's, you know, there's no, you know, it's just magic. How do you do that? And so that was something that I wanted to do, but it was always storytelling and comedy. And yeah.
When did you come to Los Angeles?
I came to Los Angeles in '94, January 1st. Remember, I played the Hyatt Hotel in Indianapolis for New Year's Eve, and then flew. I'd been living in New York. I went back to Canada, and then I flew here, and I was here 17 days before the big earthquake, which was.
I remember it.
Yeah, and so I'd been here for 2 weeks, and I thought, what the hell are these people doing out here? You've got to be insane to live here. Because I didn't realize that this doesn't happen every 2 weeks. I just figured this was a regular thing. And so I seriously considered leaving. But then again, that's the addiction. It's like, I don't want to give up this dream. So, so I stayed. But a lot of people did leave after the earthquake.
Yeah, I remember it. So were you then going to the Comedy Store or these different places to play?
Yeah, the Improv, mostly the Improv and the Laugh Factory.
Wow.
Yeah. Some managers brought me out here, and I did a little bit on Seinfeld, and that was my one acting job.
At some point, though, you then make the decision that you're going to do the writing and the books and the courses. When did you write the 90-Day Screenplay book?
The 90-Day novel came out in 2010. The 90-Day Screenplay was, I don't know, maybe 2012, 13, something like that.
Okay. Is there a chapter in the 90-Day Screenplay book that is most contested or people have the most questions about? One part of the process?
I'm not really aware of anything being particularly contested. I get a lot of people who love it. But it is, I think, different than a lot of the screenwriting books out there. And I think it's, my perception of it is that it's very much about process and less about result. And I think that when we lose ourselves in the process, the results can take care of themselves. And one of the things that I teach, here's my cat. I don't know if you're picking that up. There's Captain. But one of the things that I talk about is how dilemma is the source of the story. And a lot of writing books talk about the dramatic problem. And the implication with that for me, and why I was resistant to a lot of the writing books that I read, is that problems are solved. They're intellectual. You solve a problem. Dilemmas are resolved through a shift in perception. And so something I didn't discover this, but I sort of drilled down into it, is that the source of our story is our protagonist's dilemma. And a dilemma is a problem that can't be solved without creating another problem. You know you've got a story when what your protagonist wants is impossible to achieve based on their current approach or their current identity. Okay, in other words, it's going to necessitate a shift in perception. Okay, they're going to have to become a sort of new person, so to speak, by the end of the story. So, like when you think about problems, you think about like, I have a flat tire. I call AAA. They solve my problem. Okay, not an interesting story. But if I have a flat tire and I'm out in the desert and I call AAA, and this guy, and I'm dying of thirst, and this guy drives out to the desert, and it's the guy who's sleeping with my wife, now I've got an interesting story. Now I want to kill the man who's here to save my life. Okay, so when you can connect to your protagonist's dilemma, then you've got something to work with. The dilemma is the source of your story. And if you look at any great story, you've got a clear dilemma. Okay, and when you can connect to that, then you've got something to work with. So that's one of the things that I help writers with, is understanding the dilemma, but it's a more holistic way. You know, it's not like let's figure out your premise. The premise is born out of the protagonist's dilemma. Okay, and so it's I just think it's for me it's a more organic way of working, and then you start to see how plot emerges out of the character's struggle. Okay, so when I start to, and I'm not talking about intellectualizing the dilemma, because you can't, problems are solved, you can't figure out, when you try and figure out your protagonist's dilemma, you get stuck. But when you start to connect to the experience of the dilemma, all sorts of images and ideas and situations start to emerge to support that. And so that's, sometimes people call that the brainstorming part of the process. And so the first part of the 90-day screenplay is just doing a lot of free writing, imagining your character or your protagonist in relationship to other characters. And before you start to put a framework around it or start to insist on any kind of structure for it.
Do you think some people get very confused thinking their dilemma is their problem and it's not? Like when you were talking to the prisoners, were they very clear about what the problem was in their story? Maybe you didn't get into all that with them.
I don't know if I got into that
Okay.
with them. I can't remember that. But sometimes writers get confused about the difference between problem and dilemma. And, problems are solved. So that, like, if I say, well, that's solvable. It's not a, it's an aspect of the dilemma. Like if in other words, let's a part of the story could be that I get a flat tire and I have to get my flat tire fixed. But the dilemma is in other words, I'm jumping all over the place here. There's a movement to a scene. And so if a scene begins with a problem, like I got a flat tire, and at the end of the scene, I get my flat tire fixed and nothing else happens, we don't have a story. What has to happen is by the end of the scene, I can get my flat tire fixed, but something else happens that's going to lead the story in a new direction. In other words, my dilemma wasn't the flat tire. The dilemma is my false belief about what the flat tire means. I don't know if that makes sense. But in other words, sometimes, here's where writers get stuck. Writers think, when you hear the term dramatic problem, you assume, or you may assume, that it's your job to figure out your character's solution to their problem. Einstein says you can't solve a problem at the same level of consciousness that created the problem. In other words, it's not difficult. It's impossible. You're never going to figure out your protagonist's transformation. But so what you don't want to do is you don't want to think that your character has a clean line from the beginning to the end of the story. You need to understand that your protagonist is going to die at the end of Act 2. They're going to die to their old identity. I don't mean they're physically going to die, but they're going to die to they're going to be forced to surrender the meaning they made out of their goal. When Jimmy Stewart leaves Bedford Falls, then he'll have a wonderful life. The end of Act 2 is, I'm worth more dead than alive. Okay, so he dies to his old identity. It's a great moment where he jumps off the bridge. He wants to commit suicide. He wants to jump into the icy water. And I love this image because Clarence jumps into the icy water. And so the action is the same. Nobody ever questions this, but he jumps in to save somebody else. So he doesn't die. He's reborn. And that's the beginning of Act 3.
Okay, so then I'll give you my version of a marginalized story voice dilemma versus a middle class one. Okay. Marginalized one would be a little girl wants to go to a birthday party, but the friends in the neighborhood, the mothers know that her mom cleans houses.
Right.
And she's nice, but we don't really know her, dear. I'm so sorry. And the middle class one is someone's applying for colleges, but it turns out most of her friends are getting accepted to another one, and she's not sure if her GPA is good enough to get into that one.
Okay.
And so she's like worried that, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose all my good high school friends, and what's going to happen to my standing in that sort of group.
Got it. So these are like seeds of a story, right? Okay. So tell me, what's your question?
My question is, are the stakes higher for the author with the marginalized voice, where that means non-inclusion into a group, whereas the other one, the middle class one, is more worried about just maybe losing sort of footing and maybe losing touch. Are the stakes higher for one versus the other?
I think that I don't think of stakes. I mean, gosh, I don't know how to answer that question, because I don't think the stakes are about the actual situation. The stakes are really about the ability for the writer to convey a sense of, urgency or anxiety. In other words, yeah, but that's not, we're not really talking about dilemma. We're just talking about stakes. The stakes should always be life and death in every story. They're always life and death. If Jan Brady doesn't get a date with Tad Hamilton, she will absolutely die. Stakes are always life and death. Mm-hmm. If they're anything less than life and death, we don't care at all. We don't care at all.
Got it. Okay.
But if you want to talk about dilemma, there are two ingredients to a dilemma, as I see. So a dilemma is a problem that can't be solved without creating another problem. And when you connect to your dilemma, you're connecting to the aliveness in your story. There are two ingredients to a dilemma: a powerful want, a powerful desire, okay, and a false belief, a misperception of myself or the world. Okay, and so when Sally loves me, then I'll be complete. Okay, now that's the beginning of the story. I got to get Sally to love me in order to be complete. Do you see a powerful desire? If Sally doesn't love me, my life will be unimaginable. And the false belief is that Sally will complete me. At some point, so we've got a powerful desire. Remember that story structure is desire, surrender, transformation. We've got to surrender. I'm going to have to let go of the meaning I make out of my goal. As long as I believe that Sally's love completes me, I will forever be in bondage to Sally, or my idea of Sally's love. Because the audience or the reader is going to be disappointed if all that happens at the end of the story is that Sally loves me. That's going to be a really if Jimmy Stewart left Bedford Falls at the end of It's a Wonderful Life, we would be disappointed, because that's not what the story's about. The story isn't about, the plot is about, will Sally love me? The theme is about completeness. What does it mean to be complete? Oh, it doesn't mean completeness comes from outside of ourselves. It comes from within. Okay, so that's a dilemma. The dilemma is, what is it? The theme is completeness. If you're doing a story about justice, let's say I'm in prison, and or freedom. Let's say this is a story about what does it mean to be free. So if I'm in prison and I want to be free, I might believe at the beginning of the story that when I escape, then I'll be free. Okay, and that's the dilemma. That's the dramatic question. And then through the story, I might actually succeed in escaping and discover that I'm still not free. That could be the dark night of the soul. Let's say I escape with another buddy and we're shackled and we get away, and then he trips and twists his ankle, and now I've got to decide, I really want to be free, but now I got to take a blunt instrument and kill my buddy, and you know what I mean, and and now am I free? You know what I'm saying? And they're chasing after me, and so in my attempt to become free, in your protagonist's attempt to get what he or she wants, they move increasingly away from their desire. Okay, so my attempt to be free moves me further away from freedom, leading to the end of Act 2, where I have to let go of the meaning I made out of my goal, i.e., when I escape prison, then I'll be free. End of Act 2, I discover that true freedom comes from within. And I might discover at the end of the story that freedom might involve going back to prison, taking responsibility for my crime. Okay, and so that's the shift in perception. So that would be, so desire, I want to be free. Surrender, I have to let go of the meaning of my false belief of what freedom means. And transformation, I have a new understanding of freedom.
I think you'd use The Social Network, another video I watched.
Oh,
you want to use that as an analogy as well? Because I found that interesting.
Yeah. I think gosh, that was a long time ago. So the dilemma of The Social Network is the tension between integrity and ambition. Okay, so if I'm really ambitious and I want to make $1 billion, it's the same kind of thing. I set out on this quest, but did I steal this idea from these two gorgeous twins? And
they were quite handsome.
Yeah, and so that's what the Social Network explores. Every single scene examines the dilemma of integrity versus ambition. Okay, and so he's driven by his ambition. What do I want? I want to succeed. What do I need? I need to do the right thing. Okay, and I think it's kind of an ambiguous ending, but it leaves us with that question. Sure. Does the end satisfy the means, or does something like that?
Do you think most writers know what their story really is about?
I think at some point it's always going to be kind of a mystery. I don't know that we have to know what it's about, but I think we have to be curious as to what it's about. Okay, and that's the difference, because when I'm working with writers and we work with something I call the story structure questions, and I've got a series of experiential questions. Okay, so and people say, oh, I answered these questions. Like, they're not meant to be answered, they're meant to be inquired into. And so I think James Brooks said that he didn't know what As Good as It Gets was about, I think, until he watched it with the first audience. And that's when he realized what it was about. So I don't know that we have to know in some fundamental way what the thing's about. I also think that it can change. But if we're not curious about the theme, at some point, the story can get away on you. The plot can get away on you. You can become so seduced by your plot twists, or by the movement of the plot, that you can the theme can become untethered, and you can lose why the story wanted to exist in the first place. I work with writers sometimes, and they will write a really great, messy first draft, and then they'll give their draft to their best friend to read, and their best friend will go, I really like chapter 4, 6, and 7, but I didn't really like chapter 3, 9, and 10. And so they'll take out the chapters they didn't like. But in other words, they will abdicate authority over their work to somebody else. And this is what I'm always trying to help writers understand, that you know your story better than anybody else, even though you don't know your story, because there's something that you want to express that's valid. Okay, it's valid. And just because the story isn't doing everything you want it to do, or it's not totally working, doesn't mean that what you have to express on a fundamental level isn't valid. And so the job is to stay with the process. Stay with the process. Don't get into the result. Don't go, oh, okay, if I get rid of chapter 9 and 10, nobody's going to know that. No, there's something, you need to ask yourself, what was in chapter 9 that you were trying to express? And let's start to cull that. Let's start to cull that so that we can find that through line, because everything we write either belongs or is leading us to what ultimately belongs in the story. So if I throw something out without really being curious why I'm throwing it out, I'm doing myself a disservice. And so I'll see people who will take they'll have these wonderful, messy first drafts, and then they will start to, it'll just start to get worse and worse, because they're not trusting the reason they wrote the thing in the first place. Or they'll give it to an agent. An agent will say, it'll be more commercial if you do this to it. Sometimes that can work, but sometimes that you can kill the aliveness of something because you're giving it away.
Have you been given notes about something, a story, a screenplay, and you were like, wait a minute, this is going to kill the aliveness to it? And you had to go back and say, well, how do I make these changes that they want, but keep that spark to it? That's tough.
That is tough. That is tough, and that's the writer's job, is to is to take the spirit of the note without taking the mechanics sometimes, because you know, sometimes you're getting notes from an executive and they'll say, you know, I don't like this scene, it's not working, or you should take this out. And you've got, if you're not connected to why you're telling the story, if you're not connected to the magic, then you can lose that magic by and here's what'll happen is the executive will read the new draft and they'll go, this isn't working. And you go, but I just did what you asked me to do. Yeah, but a good executive will go, that's not what I asked you to do. I told you this wasn't working, and now it's your job to go fix what I want you to fix. But I'm not they're not a writer. So they're expecting you to do your job. And so, you know, there are a lot of really good executives who understand that when they're giving you a note, they're also expecting you to, you know, they're expecting some kind of alchemical process to happen so that you can distill the note to its nature and give them back something that's working. You know, it was like Charlie Kaufman. When he wrote Adaptation, he was adapting The Orchid Thief, and they were expecting an adaptation of that novel. Charlie Kaufman is not in that novel. Okay, and so he distilled, he took that novel, and then it went through Charlie Kaufman, and he wrote this really wonderful, brilliant, mad story. And when they got it, from what I understand, they said, what the hell is this? And then a couple of days later, they went, oh, this is wonderful. But it took them a while, I think, to get on board and realize that that's why they hired him, because they were going to get his voice and his thing. And so if we don't trust our voice, you know, it's a challenge for the writers. You've got to trust your voice in the midst of all of the fears of, I don't want to lose this job, I don't want to lose this gig, I don't, you know, I don't want to disappoint, you know, these people. That you know, that's part of it. You know, you're probably going to get replaced in Hollywood if you're a screenwriter. Doesn't mean that you did a bad job. It just means they're just covering their asses.
You think being a stand-up helped you come to peace with that? Or maybe just because when you're up there, I'm sure you're basically naked almost. You're very raw, and you've got hecklers, you've got people with all sorts of agendas throwing stuff at you, metaphorically, physically, whatever. And I think at some point you probably become more comfortable in that space. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just assuming here.
No, I think therapy did that, but I don't think comedy did that.
Okay, I thought maybe.
I don't think comedy gave me a thicker skin.
No, it didn't. Okay.
At all. No.
Okay.
No. No. I would say therapy.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and just realizing that it's the reason I think that writers or anybody, I don't know where I'm going with this. I think early on I thought as a writer, my identity was tied to my creative work. And that's dangerous. That can really mess you up. That can make you a perfectionist. That can make you bitter. That can make you a victim. And it's not. It's got nothing to do with my self-worth. And so, in fact, I think if you're a storyteller, that's a great luxury, and it's a privilege. And so you get to tell stories. And the stories aren't coming from, if you really want to tell great personal stories, you want to be connected to the universal. You want to be connected to why this is going to be relatable to other people. That's not going to make your work less personal. It's going to make it more personal, okay? Because you're going to be more willing to really get into the nitty-gritty of your struggle because you're going to understand the transformation. I don't know if does that make sense?
Yeah. So when you decided that I'm still going to be creative, but I'm going to almost have like, is it almost like having two lives? One is where you're human, and the other one is where you're a creator who's having a human experience. I know that sounds so cliche, but, and then if somebody rejects me for my creator persona, that doesn't mean I'm a bad human.
Well, I guess so. But I mean, yeah, like it always sucks getting rejected, but writers are constantly being rejected. And it's just part of it. Like the more you do it, the more it just rolls off your back. In other words, like, I'll give you an example. Let's say I write a romantic comedy and it gets into the hands of a guy who makes horror movies. And he goes, we're passing on this. They're not passing on it because it lacks quality or value. They're passing on it because they make horror movies. And that's Hollywood, is that and I'm just using a broad generalization. I'm talking about genre, but you can write a script that may not speak to the person. That doesn't mean that the script doesn't have value. You hear about these scripts that are in development for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and they finally get made, and then they win an Oscar. It's because somebody believed in them and they had a vision and they could see what that thing wanted to be. It's difficult sometimes to read a screenplay and be able to see what the movie's going to be. So you've got to believe in yourself. You've got to believe in yourself. And I think it can be easy if something gets rejected. Here's the other thing. If something's getting rejected a lot, you also need to have the humility to go, well, maybe this isn't doing everything I need it to be doing. Okay, and so that's where craft comes in. That's where you really have to understand what you're trying to do. And sometimes, you can hear writers. There's a fine line between being stubborn and having the humility to be teachable. Because if you don't have the humility to be teachable and hear why something's not working for them, you can kind of get stuck.
And then going back to working in the maximum security prison.
Right.
I know I
didn't do a lot of that.
Okay, I know, but it's just so fascinating to me. Yeah, okay,
Yeah,
all right.
yeah.
So the 2 times or whatever, however many times, sorry. You saw that humility in them. How easy was it to have them as sort of a captive audience? Sorry, that's wrong. Let me just scratch that. I guess what I'm trying to say is so many people, they go to a great school and they've kind of been groomed all their life that they're like this golden child and they're great and they're going to come and everything they do is fantastic. And that's great. They have this wonderful support system.
Right.
And then I think in some sense that can hurt them here in this industry because it's a rude awakening when someone doesn't agree with their work. Doesn't mean they don't like them personally.
Right.
So when you saw people that maybe had either been born with more humility or had been forced to adopt that attitude,
I think this business will, you will either, become humble or bitter. So because you're always going to be getting rejected, constantly getting rejected. But it's not personal. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Oh, it's great, and I love it. Where does the road diverge for the humility?
Oh,
I agree. I totally agree with you. So,
well, I think it's just, I don't know if you can teach that. I don't know if you can. I think it's just humility is going to make you a better writer because it's going to give you humanity. You're going to have compassion. You're going to, in other words, humility is just, it's going to make your job easier because you're going to also have compassion for yourself. It's going to widen your perspective. You're going to see why your writing isn't doing everything you want it to do, because as writers, I think we've all got blind spots. We don't, William Goldman talks about how you come up with these ideas and you can see this movie in your head and then you start to write it. And once you start to write it, these ideas become earthbound. They're earthbound. They're not, it's really hard work. It's really hard work to create a great story. And I just think humility is just something that if you don't have it, you might want to find a way to, you know, you're going to become humble in Hollywood just by virtue of the rejection. But I don't think there's a way to exercise humility, but I think there is a way to, I think if you have compassion for yourself and for other people, and are gentle with yourself, and have a healthy perception of rejection, or an understanding that I'm not being rejected, it's going to lead to just a happier life.
Why is it important that the hero experience false hope?
False hope is a very necessary point in the hero's journey, the protagonist's journey, because without it, there won't be a context for the surrender at the end of the second act. Okay, so let me give you an example. Let's say, I'm trying to think of a story. Well, let's just say a character. Let's say I want Sally to love me, so I'll be complete. Okay, the false hope is the moment where I have a first date with Sally, and we kiss, and yes, I'm going to get what I want. But what I want is for Sally to love me. But the reason I want it is so that I'll be complete. Okay, so the false hope is, it's sort of like going to Vegas and putting a nickel in the slot and a dime comes out and you go, by midnight, I'll be a millionaire. I just doubled my money. And then the next day you leave town on a Greyhound. That's the false hope, is the misperception the protagonist has about their situation. Okay, what the false hope is where the protagonist is not yet aware that what they're struggling with is not a problem. It's a dilemma. They think they've got a problem. They don't. They've got a dilemma. Okay, and so that's what the false hope is.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
Without the false hope, no context for the surrender. We don't understand what they're surrendering, because the protagonist isn't I'm not surrendering my desire for Sally at the end of the second act. I'm surrendering, I'm letting go of the realization that as long as I believe that Sally will complete me, I'm screwed. Okay, so I'm surrendering the meaning I make out of my goal. I'm not surrendering my goal. The goal never goes away. I never stop wanting Sally to love me.
By the way, is this Billy Crystal's POV in When Harry Met Sally? Or
no,
okay.
no. I'm just
sure.
sorry. No.
I was picturing them in the restaurant scene. And okay.
I'm just using
right, Sally.
Yeah, it's just I don't know why I was talking about Sally in my.
Sure, it's like a codependent relationship, and you're thinking that this person's going to complete you, and
or just, whatever it is. It could be about if the theme is freedom. You know, I was talking about the prison. I have to let go of the belief that escape will lead to freedom. If it's justice, I have to let go of the false belief that, so the false hope, let's say my story is about justice. I want justice. They screwed me over. I'm going to get revenge. The false hope is, yes, revenge is within my reach. Okay, that would be the false hope moment. The surrender would be the realization that an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. Okay, so the end of Act 2, there is no such thing as justice through revenge. You know, and then I might discover that justice comes through a wider perspective, perhaps compassion, you know, understanding my situation in a new way. That makes sense? So the false hope is where I believe that through revenge, justice will be meted out.
Can we talk about backstory for the character? Is
Sure.
it crucial? Not so much with a screenplay?
Oh, backstory is crucial with every story. I mean, I can't think of a story that doesn't, you know, need some kind of backstory. So, but yeah, one of the first things I do when I'm working in the 90-day novel or the 90-day screenplay, the first month of the workshop is spent imagining the world of your story, which includes the backstory. Okay, so they're not a separate thing. In other words, I want to lose myself in the world of the story, so that because backstory is going to become exposition, right? So it's necessary. It's sort of like looking at a painting. If you ever see those $49 paintings when you drive out to like the airport or something, they're selling them on the sides of the roads, and it's a landscape, but it's completely flat because it's one coat. There's no undercoat. Okay, so the backstory is the undercoat. You can't really see it, but you can feel it. You know, so like if you're going to have a snowy landscape, your undercoat, you're going to be using, you know, umbers and browns and dark colors, so that we can start to experience the depth of the snow. You can't if you just paint it white, it's just looks it's just gonna look cheesy. So that's the more work you do in really connecting to your characters' backstories, the more that backstory is going to start to get infused into the character's experience. It's going to be in the dialogue. It's going to be in the flavor of their language. It's going to be in the detail of their it's going to be in the detail.
In terms of revealing that backstory to the audience, how much can you hold that back, though? I realize maybe then the writer needs to know that backstory right away, but in terms of revealing it to the audience, let's say in a film, how effective is it to really hold back that backstory, or should it be revealed right away? Because I was thinking, like, I just saw this movie, The Mustang, and he's in prison, and you don't totally know why he's there.
Right.
You're just seeing his life, and he's working with these horses, and Bruce Dern is like this guy that's kind of pushing him around. He's in charge of the horses.
Right.
And then you finally realize what it was that landed him there, who this woman is that comes to visit him for these visitations, and the tension between them. Okay. But it was really great because you didn't know it for the longest
That's
time.
a great question, because so you're talking about mystery, and a lot of the times writers confuse mystery with withholding essential information to move the story forward. In other words, if you're writing a mystery, you don't want to confuse your reader or your audience, or you don't want to withhold something that we actually need to know. What makes a mystery really fun is that you gave us all of the essential information, but in a way where we weren't able to put it together. And we experienced the delicious surprise of, oh my God, that makes perfect sense. And there's some kind of transformative experience. But if you're writing a mystery and you're withholding something essential for us to understand what happens next, we're just going to be confused, you know, or we're going to be annoyed.
Right. No, it was done in a way that...
No, I'm not saying the Mustang. I'm saying they probably did it.
Yeah, they did it beautifully.
Did it in beautiful way. So I'm saying that there is the goal with backstory is to find ways to dramatize or disguise exposition. Okay, you want to dramatize it, you want or disguise. I mean, if you're dramatizing it, you are disguising it. But like, I used to do an exercise with my students. I haven't done it in a long time, but we go around the table and I'd say, okay, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Now, what's Jack and Jill's relationship? And the first person say they're brother and sister. Okay, the second person, how old are they? They go, they're 25. And why are they going up the hill to fetch a pail of water? Why do they need the water? The house is on fire. Okay, and then I go, okay, now that's all exposition. Now I want you to write a dramatic scene that includes all of that information. But you can't say Jack and Jill are 25 years old. You've got to find a way to convey that information, that backstory or that exposition, without us knowing that. Or the backstory would probably be why they're going up the hill to fetch a pail of water. So we need to, as they're on their way up the hill, you want to find a way for us to experience that their house is on fire. Does that make sense?
It does, right. So you're showing, not telling.
You want to show and not tell. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. We want to experience it. We want to, you know, filmmaking is taking the audience through a series of experiences that lead to a transformation.
What's a reluctant hero?
A reluctant hero. Are you talking about the end of Act 1, where I always talk about how our protagonist makes a decision at the end of the first act, and that there's reluctance around this decision. And the reluctance is a function of the dilemma. In other words, if your protagonist doesn't experience reluctance, we're not going to understand what the decision means. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Let's say Romeo and Juliet. The inciting incident is Romeo sees Juliet. Okay, so oh my God, I'm in love. And then the opposing argument, which is something I talk about in the workshops, is where we understand the dilemma. Oh my God, I'm in love with the enemy of my father. Okay, I'm in love with the family member that's the enemy of my family. And then the decision is to, in spite of that, go and stand under Juliet's balcony and profess his love. So he's not reluctant to profess his love. He's reluctant to get killed by her father. Okay, so if that's what you're asking me, the reluctant hero, because that's, I think in terms of how can I find my protagonist's reluctance at the end of Act 2? The reluctance isn't about getting what I want. The reluctance is about what it will mean if I try to get what I want. Okay, so Romeo wants love. He doesn't want to get killed. That's his dilemma, right? I want true love, but true love could mean the death of me. Okay, if you can find your protagonist's reluctance at the end of the first act, okay, with regards to this decision, you're going to be connected to the tension, your protagonist's dilemma. Your story is going to build in meaning as it progresses. Okay, because that's our goal as storytellers, is we want each page to be more interesting than the last page because the story is building in meaning. Okay, so as Romeo and Juliet move toward this climax, the story becomes more interesting, we become more invested, the stakes start to rise because of the struggle that he's having between what he wants and what he needs. Okay, so you think about any character, what they want is always outside of themselves. It's always outside of themselves. I want a pony. And what they need is always within. It's connected to the why they want the pony. When I get a pony, then I'll be popular. I want to believe in God. Why do I want to believe in God? Because then I'll be safe. Okay, so I want to have faith. What do I need? I need to trust. Okay, does that make sense? So like you see, that's the dilemma of faith. Is give me evidence, then I'll believe. It doesn't work that way. That's every story. Your protagonist is struggling with a dilemma, and a dilemma is a powerful want and a false belief. Those are the two ingredients. Okay, so I want to believe, but I don't trust, and then your protagonist is because what we care about ultimately is not whether or not the protagonist is going to believe or have faith. What we care about is how your protagonist is going to reframe their relationship to what faith means.
What are things you see most beginning writers sort of get wrong with writing an outline?
Plot. So many writers think that writing an outline is figuring out their plot. Okay, and there's something very satisfying about coming up with a plot. There's something like, oh, I've got it. But here's the problem, is that, again, Einstein says you can't solve a problem at the same level of consciousness that created the problem. Every story begins with a dramatic problem. And what happens, every writer's had this experience, you get really excited by your premise, and you start writing it, and you get halfway through, and then you get stuck. And then you're trying to make these characters interesting, but you feel like they're just, pieces on a chessboard that you're trying to move around. And so it's important to understand that story structure is not about plotting. Story structure really is the DNA of your protagonist's transformation. And so what you really want to do is you want to start to be curious about your protagonist's dilemma. Because when you really understand the nature of their struggle, the nature of their dilemma, it becomes the source of your story, and it just starts to pay off in silver dollars. It starts to give you all sorts of ideas, images, scenarios that are going to become your plot. Okay, but if you here's what I would suggest. If you want to come up with a great outline, the first thing we do in the 90-day novel, in the 90-day screenplay, is we spend 1 week imagining the world of the story and doing absolutely no outlining. Because what happens is, I would say our idea of our story is never the whole story. If you start to outline your idea of your story, you're going to get stuck. It's going to become kind of a superficial thing. But if you allow yourself to lose yourself in your characters relating to other characters, they're going to surprise you. They're going to be alive, and they're going to start to do things that you might not have imagined had you forced them into a prescribed outline. Okay, and so that's the first step, is imagine the world of your story, allow your characters to be relating to each other in ways without imposing any structure, any outline whatsoever. Now that you've got all of this raw material and you start to see how they're relating, I'll give you an example. You would never, if you're writing It's a Wonderful Life, what does he want? He wants to leave Bedford Falls in order to have a wonderful life. The midpoint of that is where Mr. Potter offers Jimmy Stewart a job. That would never, if you're outlining your story, that has nothing to do with what Jimmy Stewart wants. Okay? Mr. Potter's the devil. Okay, he's the enemy. Why would he ever offer him a job? That wouldn't make any sense. But if you're imagining the world of the story and you come to the midpoint structure question, okay, which is how does your protagonist experience temptation? It might occur to you that the devil would tempt him with a big job offer. Okay, and so that's where I feel like the way I teach story structure is different than, I've been told it's different than everybody. And it's because there's no plotting at all. There's these structure questions that are experiential questions, okay? So we're exploring your protagonist's experience at key stages in the journey. Okay, I hesitate to say the hero's journey because then people get this fixed idea, oh, you're teaching the hero's journey. No, I'm actually not. I'm teaching, what I'm teaching is that story structure is an immutable paradigm for a spiritual transformation, and that there are key stages that one goes through, including the reluctance at the end of the first act, the false hope, which we just talked about. I'm talking about now the midpoint, temptation, and then suffering toward the end of the second act, and then finally surrender at the end of the second act. These are all experiences: reluctance, false hope, temptation, suffering, surrender. They have nothing to do with plotting, and we're not talking about a reversal, so.
As someone already figuring out the ending in that before they're beginning this outline, you said, think about it for a week or whatever. Think about the crux of the story. What is it really about? Are they also figuring out the ending, or is it revealed sometimes after you do the outline?
Both. It can get revealed after you do the outline. I don't like the word figuring out because I don't think we figure anything out. But I have an exercise that I give my students to experience the ending. And it's a two-part exercise. I say, imagine your protagonist transformed at the end of the story. How is your protagonist relating differently to other characters at the end of the story? How are they relating differently than they were at the beginning? And what do they understand at the end of the story that they didn't understand at the beginning? Okay, and then do that like every day. Do that for like 10 minutes every day. And what you start to plant a flag for your protagonist at the end of the story. You start to experience your protagonist at the end of the story. Character suggests plot. When you start to experience your character relating differently to these other characters, plot naturally emerges. But you're not figuring anything out. If you try and figure it out, you're going to get stuck. And then the second thing you want to do is you want to imagine if you want to imagine the climax of your story, remember that we want our protagonist to be active through the whole story. You want to have an active protagonist. And the challenge for writers is that we tend to be sort of passive observers. We're always watching what's going on. And so when we sometimes put ourselves into the protagonist situation, sometimes the protagonist can be the least interesting character in the story. And so you want to find a way to make them active. The structure questions are always going to make your protagonist active. At the climax, you want to think about the difficult choice your protagonist makes between what he or she wants and what they need. Okay, it's a difficult choice, so that's an action. I'm making a choice. So your protagonist has to take an action between what they want and what they need. So think in terms of, like, let's say I want justice, but I believe that when I get revenge, justice will be done. So what I want is actually revenge. Okay, I want them to pay, and what I need is to have compassion. Okay, so in other words, the end of the story, the climax of the story is we're going to reframe our relationship to the theme, i.e. justice. And so I'm going to put my protagonist in a situation where he's going to have to make a difficult choice between what he wants, revenge, and what he needs is compassion. In other words, if it's not a difficult choice, he would have made the choice in Act 1. But it has to be difficult. And it doesn't have to be, sometimes we call it the battle scene, the climax of the story, but it doesn't have to be an external battle. It can be an internal battle, okay? So it doesn't have to be, it can be an internal battle that gets dramatized. Like if you think about Holly Hunter in broadcast news, the battle scene is her staring at a plane ticket on a bench at the airport because William Hurt says, here's the ticket, and what she wants is there to be she wants there to be integrity in broadcast journalism. But what she needs is to have integrity. So when William Hurt crosses the line and fakes a tear in this interview, she's furious, and she wants him to take responsibility for it so that she can go off to this exotic island for a week and frolic with him. But he's not going to. And so she is forced to make a difficult choice within herself. Am I going to get on the plane with William Hurt, or am I going to get back in the cab? And so that's the battle scene, but it's still active. She makes the choice of getting into the cab. So you want to find a way for your protagonist to make a difficult choice between what they want, which is always outside of themselves, i.e. William Hurt, and what they need, which is always within. I'm going to do the right thing.
What's the fastest way to learn screenwriting?
The fastest way to learn screenwriting? God, I don't know how to answer that question. William Goldman says screenwriting is something where sometimes your second or third one out is as good as, like, it's as good as it's going to be. And but I don't know. Screenwriting is a craft. I mean, you know, they asked Margaret Atwood was at a party once, and some guy said, "What do you?" She said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm a heart surgeon." No, he said, "I'm a brain surgeon." And he said, "What do you do?" And she said, "I'm a writer." And he said, "Oh, you know what? When I retire, I'm going to be a writer. I'm going to write." And she said, "Oh, that's great, because when I retire, I'm going to be a brain surgeon."
I can totally picture her saying that too. Yeah.
It's really hard work, and it's a craft. And I think that I think sometimes there's another quote. I can't remember who the writer was, but he said, a writer is someone for whom writing is more difficult than it is for others.
Well, I love the Margaret Atwood, though, because I remember hearing an interview where her family said to her, "Okay, it's going to be difficult for you to be a writer, but we have someone we can invite over and maybe they can give you advice."
Right.
And they were like a journalist at a paper, and they said,
right,
most likely you'll be writing, wedding announcements and obituaries. Because at that time, that's what women did. And so I don't think that was something that she wanted to do, but she kept with her poetry and these different things.
That's what, you know, Francis Coppola, he went to film school, and then he said he was hoping that he was going to get to do industrial films. And that was going to be, and so, you know, and he worked for Roger Corman, and he was, again, I think it's that humility. I think when we sort of expect that we're supposed to have everything handed to us, nothing happens. But if we just put our nose down and just keep working, you know, great things can happen. And so, circling back to your question about and now I'm blanking on the
fastest way to learn screenwriting.
Yeah, the fastest way to learn screenwriting is writing 24 hours a day.
Okay.
Except that's not true, because if you don't have, because that's what I used to do when I first started writing. Not 24 hours, but I wrote all day long, and I didn't have a life, and it wasn't until I kind of got a life and started to have experiences outside of comedy clubs and, you know, going home and writing in my garret that I actually had something to write about. So, you know, Paul Newman says, he said, if you want to be a writer, get a couple of divorces under your belt, you know, have something to write about, and have something that you really care about. You know, there are way easier ways to make money than being a screenwriter. Woody Allen said, I made more money selling my Fifth Avenue duplex than I made in my entire film career. So it's you know, if you want to make money, buy rental properties. But if you want to be a screenwriter, tell the stories that matter to you.
Right. Well, I mean, if you were a comic, I'm sure there's a lot of material, even if it's just within, you know, you can have stories about cocktail waitresses and club managers, and I mean, so there was something.
No. Comedy isn't about finding material. Comedy is about having a voice. If you have a voice, everything can be funny. Anything can be funny. You know, Mitch Hedberg's joke about, he said, I love rice. I'm going to butcher it, but I love eating anything. I love eating 2,000 of anything. But in other words, like, you don't have to, if you go out and have a life, you're going to have something to write about. Yeah, if I'm just in comedy clubs all day, yeah, I guess I could write about cocktail waitresses, but the joke is about my point of view. So the way you're going to develop a point of view is engaging with the world and starting to experience what it's like to be a human being. Then, because the joke isn't going to be about the cocktail waitress, the joke is going to be about your relationship to the cocktail waitress.
Can writers hold on to their characters too tightly?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, in fact, yeah, I'm always saying we got to hold it loosely. If you're our idea of our characters is never the whole character. In fact, it drives me crazy when writers say, oh, my character would never do that. I think of drama as characters behaving uncharacteristically. Okay, so a nun robs a bank. You know, a bank robber saves a child on the way out of the bank. It's when you're writing a story or imagining the world of a story and a character does something that seems out of character, our job is to trust that and be curious about how to support it rather than going, my character would never do that. Characters can do anything if you can find a way to support it.
So when someone says that and you challenge them, do you find that most writers back down, or do they become so stubborn in their ideas of who that character is that they're not willing to bend?
Well, I don't teach like that. So I don't, like, I mean, if I have a student who's challenging me, what is there to challenge? I'm just asking questions. It's the way I teach. It's the Socratic method. I'm not
draconian.
Ever. Yeah, so I would never have that with one of my students. I would just say, you know, why do you make that choice? That's a question I always ask my students. Why do you make that choice? You know, why does the character do that? And And it's either, in other words, we've got to be willing to explore blind alleys. So if we just assume that our story is going in a particular direction, then we might be denying ourselves, a lot of riches by not exploring the opposite way. I always say to my writers, if you know your character's going to go left, you have to go right. In other words, if in this scene Bill is going to propose to Sally and Sally's going to say yes, that's not an interesting scene. Sally, will you marry me? Yes, I will, Bill. That's not a scene. There's no meaning that gets conveyed. Meaning gets conveyed through conflict or tension. And so we want to explore all the reasons why Bill can't get married and all the reasons why Sally is afraid to say yes. Then now we're going to understand what the scene's about. Because the scene isn't about Bill proposing to Sally. The scene is about Bill being afraid to work for Sally's father. You know what I mean? Will you work with, Sally, will you marry me? And then we can spend our lives and I can write tone poems. And she's like, no, if I'm going to marry you, you're going to need to come work for my dad, the hitman. Now we've got a story. Okay, so if you know you're going to go left, go right. If you think your character's going to do this, hold that loosely, because you're going to discover that your idea of your character isn't the whole character. It's not that it's incorrect, it's incomplete. And the irony is that when you hold it loosely, your character actually becomes the most full version of the character you imagined. It's not going to do exactly what you wanted he or she to do, but it's actually going to become, the goal of storytelling is for the whole to be greater than the sum of its parts, not to be the sum of its parts.
Why do writers get stuck?
Why do writers get stuck? Well, you want to have a good outline. Writers get stuck sometimes because they come up with a great idea and they immediately start writing the idea, which is fine. But at some point, you're going to want to stop and do some kind of an outline. And here's the thing, is that this is where writers will go, yeah, but I heard that Woody Allen never outlines and Charlie Kaufman never outlines. And the truth is, they do. They probably just don't write their outline down. But they have been writing stories for such a long time, and they probably actually do have lots of notes, but they've been doing that. They have developed such story structures become second nature for them. They've become masters. And so they are naturally they're naturally connected to this process. But I would think the main reason writers get stuck is because they're not working off some kind of an outline. It could be even the most, rudimentary outline. But you have to have something to work from. Or here's the irony, is that if you don't have an outline, you're actually going to lose confidence when you get to a point where you start to feel stuck. Because you're always going to get stuck at some point in the process. But if you've got some kind of basic sense of the story structure, basic sense of the movement, you can actually get excited about the point where you get stuck, because you know where the story is going to go, and that's where you can start to move in all. You can kind of relax into the panic and let your characters speak to you and go in directions that you had never imagined, that are actually going to often support where the story wants to go. Okay, that's why I would say, if you know you're going to go left, go right. Okay, so if I know this is going to happen, let me explore the complete opposite and relax in the fact that I'm going to get to where I'm going. It's just I'm not going to arrive there in the same way I thought I was going to.
Thinking of like The Firm.
Yeah.
With Tom Cruise, and then that moment when, well, I don't want to give any spoilers away, but
I don't think you're giving spoilers away to a 30-year-old movie. If you haven't watched The Firm yet.
So I'm just thinking of the living room scene where he comes back and
remember
the partners are there and maybe I'm butchering.
Oh
it,
yeah.
but
Yeah, right.
So yeah, and
right, and totally different. This is where Robert Towne. I love this. Robert Towne adapted The Firm, okay, and he because I always thought great novel, except the ending felt like a total cheat because Mitch McDeere ends up on a sailboat with $10 million. And he's like in the Cayman Islands or something like that, and he's not a lawyer anymore. But he wanted to be a lawyer. He loved being a lawyer. And so Robert Towne, he read it and he was like, well, wait a second. Why can't he still be a lawyer at the end of the story, but have a transformation? And so the living room scene, it's been decades since I've seen this movie, but the living room scene is where he confronts is it the mobsters and the
I believe so,
and
I think
firm.
Isn't his wife there too? Maybe I'm picturing two different stories.
But what he basically does is he says, I'm a lawyer and I work for you, the mob, but I also have all of your shit. And if anything happens to me, you guys are fucked. And so that's what, John Grisham didn't do. But that's what makes Robert Towne a genius, is because he understands story structure. He understands transformation. I mean, John Grisham is brilliant. I love John Grisham. But the ending of that felt like a cop-out to me because he just goes off into like that ending is actually a tragedy. He's now going to spend the rest of his life in hiding in the novel, in the Cayman Islands, in hiding with $10 million. That sounds like a nightmare. I don't want to, who wants that life? But because he doesn't get to, he's got to be in hiding. But the way Robert Towne did it was masterful because he was true to the dramatic question that was about a guy who was an idealistic lawyer who takes a job for a dirty firm and ends up in a horror show, and he manages a way to climb out and outsmart the villains. Brilliant.